What happens when a power-hungry cop faces off against a woman who outshines him in every truly important way? It began on a Wednesday night, late, just after 11 p.m., the time when Toledo, Ohio's streets are nearly deserted, with only a few workers heading home or someone like Lieutenant Naomi Carter driving through the town. She had just finished a lengthy military meeting in Indiana, more than 120 miles away. The dim light in her car reflected her face, sharp features, eyes deep with experience. Naomi wasn't in a rush. She kept to the speed limit, obeying all the traffic laws. Her hand firmly gripped the steering wheel. Every movement of hers reflected a calm that had been honed over years of living between the lines of order and chaos. The night air streamed through the cracked window, bringing the familiar damp scent of the lakeside city. Naomi took a deep breath, letting the sound of the wind and the rhythm of the wheels merge into a soothing melody. Her mind was already easing, thinking of the familiar warmth of home in Fort Wayne, where, in just a few hours, she would take off her heavy shoes and sit by the window with a warm cup of tea in hand. But then, a sudden flash of light pierced the peaceful night. Wham! The red and blue lights of a patrol car flicked on behind her. In that brief moment, Naomi's heartbeat skipped a beat. Her hand instinctively tightened on the wheel before quickly relaxing. Years of experience taught her that. In moments like this, calmness was not just an advantage, it was survival. She switched on her right turn signal, slowed down in an orderly fashion, and pulled over well off the main lane. Her movements were clean, without a single wasted gesture. The patrol car remained close behind, headlights glaring in the rearview mirror, blinding her. Despite the blinding light, Naomi kept both hands on the wheel, at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, clear, visible, exactly as she had taught hundreds of young soldiers under her command. The SUV came to a complete stop. Its engine hummed smoothly, evenly, just like her heart, unwavering. A patrol car door swung open. The sound echoed in the silent night, like the click of a safety being disengaged. Through the rearview mirror, Naomi saw a man step out, tall, muscular, his police uniform sharply defined under the streetlights. His right hand rested casually on his sidearm, his left holding a flashlight. Instead of going around to the passenger side as the safety protocol advised, the officer walked straight to the driver's side window, shining the flashlight directly into her eyes without warning. No greeting, no introduction. "License and registration," his gruff voice rang out, breaking the silence like a rough, harsh blade. Naomi Carter took a slow breath. She lowered the window halfway, keeping her hand on the wheel, just enough to show cooperation but also enough to protect herself. In a calm, clear tone, she asked, "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" The flashlight beam pierced her face, with no mercy. "You were swerving between lanes, didn't signal. Looks like you've been drinking," the officer sneered, his gaze betraying suspicion and something else, like contempt. Naomi raised one eyebrow slightly. "I haven't been drinking," she responded curtly. Her composed reply seemed to ignite a flicker of irritation in the officer. He repeated his demand, louder this time, with an imposing tone. "License, registration." Naomi didn't argue. Slowly and deliberately, she opened the glove compartment, pulled out her car and ID documents, and handed them through the window. "Along with that," she added calmly, not to threaten, but to make a clear statement, "this is a government vehicle. I'm a federal employee." For a brief moment, the officer's eyes flashed with a mocking smile. "Military, huh?" "No one's above the law, lady," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm and challenge. Naomi held his gaze, unflinching. She had faced far worse looks than that, in much harsher places. But deep inside she knew, tonight, on this quiet road in an unfamiliar city, what was happening was not just a routine check. Something, a danger, was quietly brewing, waiting to erupt from the arrogance of the man before her. And Naomi Carter understood this would not just be an ordinary night drive anymore. Naomi Carter could feel the cold from the flashlight grip in the officer's hand as the blinding light pressed hard into her eyes. She didn't squint, nor did she look away. The instinct of a soldier who had stood in the midst of blood-soaked lands taught her, never show weakness. The man before her, Sergeant Brad Mercer, a white cop with a muscular build, tanned skin, and a gaze that was cold and arrogant. He stood tall, as if he himself represented the ultimate authority on this land. No greeting, no introduction, no mention of the standard police procedure when approaching a stopped vehicle. Just a blunt, bare command. "License and registration," Brad growled, the flashlight still shoved into Naomi's face like a blade of light. Naomi, maintaining her steady breath, gently asked, "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" The question wasn't challenging, just a request for the minimum information required by law. But for Brad Mercer, any delay, any question that didn't immediately comply, was a personal challenge. He sneered, a twisted smile spreading across his rock-like face. "You were swerving between lanes, didn't signal. Looks like you've been drinking." Naomi tilted her head slightly, a very small movement, but in her eyes there was a flash, not of fear, but of cold, calculating clarity. "I haven't been drinking," she replied, each word articulated precisely, without hesitation. Brad snorted, as if her denial only irritated him further. He took a step closer, the flashlight almost touching Naomi's forehead. All the signs were clear. He wasn't seeking the truth. He was seeking submission. And when Naomi, with all her calm, slowly opened the glove compartment, pulled out the car documents and her federal ID, Brad didn't even lower his voice. She handed the documents through the window, not in a rush, not in fear. "This is a government vehicle. I'm a federal employee," Naomi stated, not making excuses, just stating the facts, a detail any officer should carefully consider before continuing. But Brad Mercer was not the type to consider things. In his simple world there were only two types of people, those who give orders and those who obey. He glanced briefly at the federal ID, then, with a mixture of contempt and challenge, sneered, "No one's above the law, lady." His voice emphasized the word lady, as if to mock that a black woman, no matter what title she held, was worth less than the uniform and badge on his chest. A quiet wave of insult washed over Naomi, but she didn't react. She didn't let emotions take the lead. She didn't allow someone else's arrogance to pull her down. She sat up straight, her hand still placed firmly on the wheel, her gaze neither avoiding nor challenging, simply the gaze of someone who knows their own worth. Outside, the night wind blew, scattering dry leaves across the empty road. But here, between Naomi and Brad, the air thickened, heavy, tense, signaling that things would not end with just a ticket. There was something in Brad Mercer's stance, in his gaze, a desire to dominate, to prove his power at any cost, that made Naomi understand. He would not stop here. And she, with her experience, her honor, and her unyielding self-respect, could not allow herself to step back. The night in Toledo suddenly felt colder, but Naomi Carter knew. The true cold wasn't from the wind. It came from the confrontation that was about to explode, between a man who thought his power was invincible and a woman who had learned that her dignity must be defended at all costs. The air inside the car was thick, as if even the slightest touch could ignite an explosion. Naomi Carter remained still, both hands placed firmly on the steering wheel, her gaze never leaving the officer standing outside her door. In the pale yellow light, Brad Mercer seemed taller, his shadow stretching long across the road, flickering with every gust of wind. Then, in a tone Naomi had grown all too familiar with throughout her career, the voice of those who believed power was a weapon to oppress, Brad gave the order, "Step out of the vehicle." Naomi did not comply immediately. She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, sharp as a thin blade. "I've cooperated. I haven't been drinking. Could you please tell me why I'm being asked to step out of the vehicle?" It wasn't a defiance. It was a perfectly legal question, stemming from every citizen's right to know why they are being stopped. But for Brad Mercer, any request for an explanation was a personal challenge to his fragile ego, hidden beneath the badge he wore. He took another step closer, his breath visible in the cold night air, the flashlight still aimed directly at Naomi's face. "You're refusing a lawful order," he growled, his tone beginning to shift into a dangerous edge. Naomi remained unmoving, her gaze unwavering, calm, composed, like a mirror reflecting Brad's raw arrogance. "I'm just requesting a formal explanation," Naomi responded, not raising her voice but clear and firm. Her response, instead of calming the situation, seemed to pour fuel on the fire of Brad Mercer's indignation. He gripped the door handle, his arm tensing, his eyes darkening with frustration. Without warning, he yanked the car door open. The metallic screech pierced the stillness of the night, tearing through the silence. That move wasn't just a demand for cooperation. It was a threat, a raw display of coercive power. "Get out now!" Brad shouted, his voice low and heavy, as if speaking to a criminal, not a lieutenant in the U.S. military. In that moment, Naomi Carter knew. This was no longer just a routine traffic stop. With a slow, almost imperceptible movement, Naomi slid her right hand into her coat pocket and retrieved her phone. Still seated, she pressed the record button. A faint beep sounded, just loud enough for her to hear, but not enough for Brad to notice. Then, in a steady, composed voice, she declared, "Just so we're clear, this conversation is being recorded." In that brief moment, Naomi saw a subtle shift on Brad's face, a hesitant blink, a barely perceptible clench of his jaw. A part of him understood any action now could become evidence, but that hesitation lasted less than a second. His arrogance, his self-satisfaction, and the long-held habit of wielding unchecked power quickly filled the void in Brad Mercer's mind. He straightened up, his gaze as cold as ice, his hand still near his sidearm, a silent threat. "Step out now," he repeated, his tone no longer patient. Naomi knew that from this moment on, every step she took, every word she spoke would be scrutinized, not only for her own protection, but to expose the abuse of power before her. And in the chilling silence of Toledo's night, Naomi Carter opened the car door. She stepped out, standing tall, head held high, neither defying nor submitting, simply and decisively, carrying all the dignity of a woman who had stood on the edge of life and death and never bowed before injustice. On the cold sidewalk, the shadows of the two figures stretched long. One believed himself to be invincible. The other knew that, in the end, the truth would always be stronger than guns and badges. And thus, the true confrontation, the battle without gunfire but full of peril, officially began. Under the cold streetlights, the shadows of the two figures, one tall, the other small but resilient, stretched long across the empty road. Naomi Carter stood straight, her face calm, with only the soft exhale of her breath forming a faint mist in the cold night air. Brad Mercer, his face stiff with the arrogance that had been challenged, pulled a small pen from his belt and lowered himself to the ground, using it to draw a faint line in the dirt. No explanation, no reassuring smile, as a professional officer should have done. Just the heavy silence and quick, almost brutish motions. He stood up, pointing at the faded line he had drawn, and ordered, "Walk the line, heel to toe, hands by your sides." Naomi looked down. A sloppy line, nearly disappearing under the pale yellow light. A subtle but bitter insult, as if she didn't deserve a proper testing procedure. Without a word, Naomi took a deep breath, then stepped forward. One step, then another. Her heel touched her toe, her body straight as a blade. Each step as if she were on parade, steady, unwavering. Her shadow stretched long across the dusty line, quivering under the dim light, but each movement was sure, as though the ground itself was molding to her every step. Across from her, Brad Mercer stood with his arms crossed, his cold gaze fixed on her, waiting, or, more accurately, hoping, for a slip, a misstep, a stumble, a word of anger, but nothing at all. Naomi Carter, the black woman who had once led troops through the most chaotic battlefields in the world, walked across that amateur line as if it were a path of honor. No complaints, no unnecessary explanations, only a resolve so chilling it could be felt in the stillness of the night. When she completed the final step and turned to face Brad, a silence hung between them. The night's coldness no longer came from the temperature, but from the silent defeat slowly bleeding within the man before her. Brad Mercer furrowed his brow, quickly hiding his clenched fist behind his back. He knew, deep down, that she had passed the test. No doubt, no grounds to go any further, but his wounded ego, his arrogance, wouldn't let him end it here quietly. Without another word, Brad turned on his heel and quickly walked back to the patrol car. A few minutes later, he returned, holding the ticket book, the pen coldly gliding across the paper, the rigid letters digging into his wounded pride. Without looking at Naomi, he tore the ticket out of the book and held it in front of her. "Failure to maintain lane," Brad said, his voice dry, his frustration no longer hidden. Naomi took the ticket. No argument, no complaint, but her gaze, calm, deep, like a still lake that had just reflected the true face of the man before her, was sharper than any rebuttal. She didn't need to speak. The way she looked directly at Brad Mercer, no hatred, no fear, only a glaring truth, made him for a moment feel small, exposed, and pitiful. Naomi folded the ticket carefully and placed it in her coat pocket. No thank you, no goodbye, only silence. A silence heavier than any resistance. Then, with steady steps, Naomi turned back to the car. The door slammed shut behind her with a decisive clink, as if closing off the entire farce Brad Mercer had just attempted to create to hold on to his decaying power. Inside the car, Naomi sat up straight, her hands firmly on the wheel. Her eyes, reflected in the rearview mirror, were still sharp and clear. She started the engine, pulled away, leaving Brad Mercer standing alone under the patchy streetlight. But Naomi knew tonight's events wouldn't end with a ticket. No, it had only just begun. Naomi Carter's black SUV gradually disappeared into the night of Toledo, leaving Brad Mercer standing alone, his hand shoved deep into his belt, his gaze darkening under the solitary streetlight. But even now, as the silence pressed down on the empty street, Brad still didn't realize the storm that was silently waiting ahead. He gripped the radio tightly, muttering something meaningless about completing the traffic stop, then drove back to the station as if nothing significant had happened that night. Back at the Toledo police station, an old concrete building nestled between the weathered streets, Brad lazily threw the body cam onto the charger, the movement so careless that the device almost bounced back onto the desk. He didn't bother checking the footage. He didn't make any notes. He just swiped his finger across the touch screen, clicked a few things to finish the procedure, then walked to the break room. The break room was empty. Only the soft hum of the coffee machine and the flickering fluorescent lights above. Brad collapsed into a sagging chair, grabbed a paper cup, poured himself some cold coffee, and laughed loudly with his fellow officers working the night shift. A military girl, thinking her ID card is some sort of sacred decree, he gleefully recounted, stirring his coffee as he gestured dramatically. Trying to act tough, but in the end, she still had to walk the line like all the other drunks. The group chuckled, their laughs half mocking, half indifferent, the kind of laughter that fills places where power is assumed and abuse of authority is commonplace. But not everyone was laughing. In a corner of the room, Officer Chris Diaz, a young Latin officer who had only been on the force for a few years, looked up from his phone, furrowing his brow. He squinted as if trying to recall something, then asked, "What's her name, Brad?" Brad shrugged, not really caring. Naomi Carter. Chris Diaz sat up straight, his eyes sharpening. "Naomi Carter?" he repeated, his voice lower. "Lieutenant Naomi Carter? The one who spoke at the Ohio Police Academy last year?" The atmosphere in the break room froze for a beat. Brad sneered, his disdain obvious. "Could be. I don't care. On these streets, her name or her rank doesn't mean anything. This is my turf." His words, if anyone listened closely enough, weren't just a statement of confidence. They carried a blind belief that the silver badge on his chest could make anything right, as long as he said so. Chris Diaz leaned back in his chair quietly, his hand tightening slightly around his coffee cup. He remembered very clearly the speech Lieutenant Naomi Carter had given last year, a talk about honor, discipline, and the true strength of those who serve. A woman who had once commanded military transport units through the most war-torn regions, awarded medals for bravery and leadership. A woman whose every word had left the entire auditorium silent in awe. And now, Brad Mercer, notorious at the station for his crude and arrogant demeanor, had unknowingly crossed paths with that same woman, completely unaware that he had stepped into a battle he couldn't possibly understand. Chris glanced at Brad, reveling in his victory, as if he had taken down an ordinary criminal, and a faint unease stirred inside him. Very slight, but sharp, like a knife grazing the surface of still water. Not everyone stays silent forever. And some people, when insulted, will not choose to back down. They will fight, but not with shouts or fists. They fight with the truth. Chris didn't say another word. He quietly finished his cold coffee, while the self-satisfied laughter of Brad echoed down the empty hallway. And in that silence, somewhere beyond the station, Naomi Carter was quietly preparing for a battle that Brad Mercer would never have a chance of winning. As Brad Mercer's self-satisfied laughter echoed through the cold hallways of the Toledo police station, somewhere else, a silent yet powerful wave was rising. Naomi Carter drove her black SUV through the night, heading back to her base in Fort Wayne. The lights from the guard station cast long streaks on the windshield, but she saw nothing. Naomi's mind at that moment was like a barren land, empty, tense, and freezing cold. She arrived at her small apartment in the barracks just before 2 a.m. Leaving her keys, coat, and military boots at the door, Naomi sank into the old chair by her desk, her hands gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned white. She couldn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because she was angry. A cold, bottled-up anger, not the impulsive kind, but the kind that has festered for years in those who have been forced to stay silent for far too long. Every time she closed her eyes, Naomi saw the flashlight shining directly into her face, heard the voice full of contempt, felt the rough hand yanking the car door as if trying to strip away her dignity right there on the streets of America, the country she had sweat, bled, and spent her youth serving. And worse still, she knew tonight she was not alone. Countless others, black women, everyday citizens, those looked down upon simply for their status, skin color, or gender, had been through the same thing. But no one was filming, no one believed them, no one stood by them. Naomi let out a heavy sigh. She opened her laptop. The dim blue light swept across the room, casting a glow on her resolute face, a face that had weathered gunfire, crossed battle lines on cold nights where every decision meant life or death. Placing her phone next to the computer, Naomi opened the video. The scene from tonight played out clearly, from how Brad Mercer approached, his arrogant attitude, the coercive actions, the contempt that showed in every gesture, every glance. No exaggeration needed, no embellishment. The truth was enough to speak for itself. She opened a blank document and began typing. Time, 11:16 p.m. Location, Reynolds Street, Toledo, Ohio. Details: stopped without clear cause, coerced out of the vehicle, asked to perform an unwarranted sobriety test, unprofessional behavior, potential abuse of power, and discrimination. The words appeared steadily, coldly, like the blade of a scalpel slicing open a truth long concealed in dry reports and forgotten logs. She attached the video from her phone. She created a parallel report detailing the violations of administrative procedure and civil rights. She filed a formal complaint with the Toledo Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. Not once did she hesitate. Not once did she stop to consider whether she should continue, because Naomi Carter knew this battle was no longer just for her. "Not for me," she whispered like a vow, "but for all those who've been treated like trash simply because of their skin color, gender, or position." She remembered the young soldiers under her command, the boys and girls carrying dreams of serving their country, but always knowing that beyond the battlefield, sometimes they had to fight against prejudice and injustice even on their own soil. Naomi finished the report, but when she clicked send, there was no thunderous roar or fireworks bursting in the sky, only the simple sound of a click, small, quiet, but carrying the power of a smoldering fire, one strong enough to burn down even the most arrogant walls. She leaned back in her chair. Her tired eyes gazed out the window, where the stars still hung silently in the vast night sky. Naomi knew, from this moment on, nothing would be simple anymore. The silence that had reigned for so long had been broken. And those like Brad Mercer, those who thought power was eternal, who believed the silence of others meant forgiveness, would soon face a different truth. A truth, this time, they couldn't ignore. As the dawn's light crept through the fogged windows of her office in Fort Wayne, Naomi Carter sat quietly, watching the sunrise. She wasn't waiting for a miracle. She wasn't expecting repentance. She was simply waiting for the truth to come to light, just as the sun, sooner or later, breaks through the night. And while Naomi returned to her everyday duties, across the city of Toledo, the wheels of justice began to turn for the first time, slowly, but unstoppable. 3 days later, on a dreary Monday morning, Brad Mercer was sitting in the police station parking lot, sipping hot coffee and checking his shift schedule on his phone, when a staff courier gently tapped on his car window. Brad rolled down the window. The courier handed him a light yellow envelope, sealed tight, with Sergeant Brad Mercer's name printed boldly on the front. Without a thank you, Brad ripped open the envelope right there, his shoulders tense in his uniform, still smelling faintly of bleach. Inside was just a few lines of black print on white paper. Plaintiff, Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter. Charges, unlawful detention, threats, abuse of power. Brad blinked, then laughed derisively, the sound echoing in the quiet parking lot. A joke, he muttered, crumpling the paper in his hand like worthless trash. In Brad's mind, the incident from that night was just another routine traffic stop. A small ticket, a standard sobriety test, things that happened hundreds of times in his career without anyone caring. To him, Naomi Carter was just another name, another face that refused to submit immediately and needed to be taught who really held the power on these streets. Nothing serious, nothing new. Brad carelessly shoved the paper back into the envelope, dumped the leftover coffee onto the ground, and swaggered into the station as usual. But when Brad pushed open the door to the break room, where just days before he had been bragging about his victory, he immediately sensed a shift. No more rude nods, no more short laughs of agreement. Instead, an odd silence. A silence that felt uncomfortable, heavy as a stone, pressing down on his chest. Quick glances, conversations that abruptly stopped when he walked by. Polite nods, but eyes avoiding his. Brad furrowed his brow. An unfamiliar unease began to stir inside him, a feeling he hadn't recalled since his rookie days. From across the room, Officer Chris Diaz caught his eye. Chris gave a slight, polite nod, but his gaze held something, not contempt, not exactly pity, but more like a quiet reminder. You've crossed a line, and this time there will be consequences. Brad ignored that gaze. He straightened his coffee cup, plopped down into a chair, trying to act nonchalant. But the whispers in the corners of the break room, the eyes no longer hiding their scrutiny, felt like needles poking through the arrogance that had once shielded him. Just a week ago, Brad Mercer had been one of the untouchable officers in Toledo, a man with a heavy voice, accustomed to wielding power as an unquestioned weapon. Now, he was starting to feel the cracks. Cracks that didn't require yelling or fists, just the truth, silently but sharply, wearing him down little by little. And Brad, though still grinning outwardly, deep inside began to understand. The storm was coming. A storm that this time he wouldn't easily withstand with empty excuses. Brad Mercer sat motionless in the break room, trying to ignore the unfamiliar glances from his colleagues. But just a few miles away, in a small office hidden behind the concrete walls of the Fort Wayne base, a quiet but resolute preparation was underway. Naomi Carter wasn't looking for the spotlight. No press contact, no social media posts. She understood, real battles are not won with sensational headlines. They are won with precision, with discipline, with undeniable truth. In the quiet room, Naomi sat across from Delaney Price, a military lawyer with a polished appearance, her hair neatly tied back, her eyes sharp as a surgical blade. On the table was an open laptop, the screen displaying the video Naomi had filmed on that fateful night. Naomi didn't blink as she reviewed the footage. She didn't once look away from each frame. She watched herself, the flashlight beam shining directly into her face, her calm voice, the polite questions, each gesture impeccably measured. And she saw Brad Mercer clearly, his domineering stance, his hand hovering near his sidearm, his eyes filled with frustration when his authority wasn't submitted to completely. Delaney paused the video at one frame, where Mercer yanked open the car door. "Here," she said, her voice low and firm. "Coercive action without a legitimate basis. This is a strong point." Naomi nodded slightly. No excitement, no tension. She knew that the calmness now was as important as the steady steps she took that night on the dusty line beneath the streetlights. Delaney rewound the clip, this time to the scene of the sobriety test. Naomi's steps, straight, even, unwavering, under the scrutinizing gaze of Brad. "He has no objective grounds to write a ticket," Delaney emphasized, her eyes fixed on the screen. "No breathalyzer, no dangerous behavior, no threatening words." Naomi sat up straight, her hands lightly clasped on her lap. A moment of silence filled the room, the only sounds being the clicks of the mouse and the scratching of a pen on the notepad. After a while, Naomi spoke softly, but with weight in her voice. "To win, it has to be precise, no emotion." It wasn't just a legal strategy, it was how Naomi had lived for 22 years in the military. In the midst of chaos, amidst gunfire, in life-and-death decisions, the only thing that kept her alive wasn't anger or pride, but discipline. Absolute focus on the goal. Delaney nodded, her gaze holding a sense of genuine respect. "We have the evidence, we have the violated procedures, but Naomi," she paused, leaning forward, her voice dropping, "you also need to prepare yourself." Naomi looked up, her eyes gleaming in the cold light of determination. "For what?" she asked. Delaney exhaled slowly. "Filth. They'll try to attack you. Your skin color, your rank, even your personality. They'll do everything they can to make you the problem, rather than focus on his behavior." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She looked out the window, the sky turning a steely gray, signaling an approaching storm. A moment later, she turned back, her voice steady but as heavy as stone. "I've faced men with guns pointed at my head halfway across the world. He thinks some rude questions or dirty tricks can make me falter." Delaney chuckled softly, a smile of genuine respect. "Then let's start preparing for the battle." On the wall, an old clock ticked away with dry, crisp sounds, each tick like a small drumbeat, signaling an impending showdown, not loud, not armed, but every bit as fierce. And this time, Naomi Carter wouldn't be alone. By her side was the truth. And this time, the man hiding behind the badge would have to face something he'd never considered: responsibility. Preparing for battle does not mean avoiding it. And as the hands of the clock slowly pushed time toward the day of the trial, Naomi Carter stood, not just as a plaintiff, but as a living symbol of unyielding resilience. That morning, the faint sunlight spread over the steps leading to the Toledo City Courthouse. A cool breeze swept through, making the flags at the top of the building flutter, as though signaling that something significant was about to unfold. Naomi Carter ascended each step, her movement steady, dressed in full military uniform as required by military protocol, a row of medals glistening on her chest in the morning light. Each medal was not just metal. They were witnesses to the battles she had survived, the wounds she had overcome, and the vows she had upheld, in silence, in dust, in places where gunfire and bombs had once determined life and death in an instant. No boasting, no grand declarations. Her mere presence, as herself, was the loudest statement. In the courtroom, the air thickened from the moment Naomi pushed the door open. Brad Mercer was already seated at the defendant's table, his gray-green uniform crisp, his face trying to maintain a stoic expression. But when his gaze inadvertently met Naomi Carter's image, standing straight, her uniform perfectly aligned, her medals gleaming, he faltered for a moment. A blink. Small, but enough to show the first crack in the armor of arrogance he had worn for so long. This was no longer the woman he thought he could easily humiliate on a dark street corner. This was a lieutenant colonel of the United States Army, a woman who had spent her life fighting to protect the ideals he, through his ignorance and abuse of power, had dismissed. In the gallery, the seats quickly filled. There were military uniforms sitting in silence. Soldiers from Fort Wayne, Naomi's old colleagues, friends. There were dark suits, lawyers, curious civilians, veterans who understood the value of a badge and the shame when it was betrayed. Every eye was focused on Naomi. No one spoke a word. But the atmosphere, still solemn, was the unspoken proof that today justice would not be easily ignored. Naomi walked straight to her seat, each step steady as if the very floor beneath her feet had solidified in her presence. When she sat down next to Attorney Delaney Price, Brad Mercer glanced over his shoulder. He met Naomi's eyes, calm, without hatred, without fear. Only a cold, straightforward challenge. I know who I am. And what about you? Mercer swallowed hard. His hands clenched subtly on his thighs. A small gesture, but one that did not escape the sharp gaze of those present. At the plaintiff's table, Delaney Price opened the case file, carefully arranging the documents. At the defendant's table, defense attorney Charles Brenner leaned in close to Mercer, whispering last-minute instructions. His tone firm, but with a hint of uncertainty, as if he already knew they were stepping into a difficult fight. On the bench, Judge Cynthia Morales entered, her black robe flowing behind her like an invisible shadow that had just descended. All rise. The entire courtroom stood. The wooden chairs creaked in the near-perfect silence. Naomi Carter, standing straight, her head held high, not out of arrogance, but because of the self-respect earned over a lifetime. Brad Mercer, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if the uniform on his body suddenly became 10 times heavier. "Please be seated." Judge Morales' voice rang out, firm and dignified. "This civil case, Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter versus Sergeant Brad Mercer, will now begin." Outside the courthouse, the biting wind howled, making the leafless trees shake with a rustling sound. Inside the courtroom, another storm had just officially begun, a storm that this time no one could ignore. The atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to thicken immediately after Judge Morales' opening statement. Every gaze, every breath, waited for the pivotal moment. The truth would be revealed, bare and undeniable. Naomi Carter sat upright, her gaze calm yet sharp, as Attorney Delaney Price stood and walked to the large projector screen set up before the jury. "Your Honor," Delaney began, her voice firm, each word weighted like stone, "we would like to present video evidence from the incident on the night of January 17th. The lights in the courtroom dimmed. The first video appeared on the screen, the footage filmed from Naomi's own phone, which she had quietly turned on that fateful night. The first frame, the harsh beam of a flashlight shining directly into Naomi's face through the car window. The sound rang out, Brad Mercer's harsh voice, "License and registration." No greeting, no minimum courtesy. No one in the room moved. Only the jury's pens slowly scraped across the white paper, recording every detail. The next segment, Naomi, her voice calm and polite, asking the reason for being stopped. Brad Mercer, holding the flashlight, his eyes unusually alert, immediately accused her of swerving, possibly drinking, without any basis other than his own subjective impression. The screen zoomed in, Brad's hand hovering near his weapon, unnecessary yet full of threat. A small gesture, but in the eyes of those trained, especially the military personnel in the room that day, it screamed the truth. He wasn't seeking safety, he was seeking submission. The next segment, Mercer yanking Naomi's car door open. The metallic sound rang out like a slash to the bare minimum respect owed to a citizen. The entire courtroom held its breath. Finally, the video showed Naomi walking the sobriety test line, each step firm, each breath steady. No stumbling, no signs of intoxication. Just a woman, proud, unwavering, walking through a humiliating test set up simply because she refused to bow down. The screen faded to black. The courtroom fell into a silence so deep that even the sound of a pen scratching on paper seemed like a knife cutting into the palm of the hand. Delaney gave a slight nod to Judge Morales, then moved on to the second segment, the body cam footage from Brad Mercer's own camera. The images appeared, clear and irrefutable. This time, not only was the flashlight shining directly into Naomi's face, but also the harsh shouting louder than necessary, the uncontrolled language, full of veiled threats, the clearly domineering stance, hand always near the weapon, a readiness to act despite Naomi's full cooperation. No commentary was needed from Delaney. The video itself told the story, a story of power abused, a story of subtle discrimination, not needing to shout, not needing to speak, but laid bare in every raised eyebrow, every sneering look. Delaney moved closer to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice low and steady, "you've just witnessed it firsthand. No one needs to guess. No one needs to infer." Her gaze swept across the attentive faces. This is not a misunderstanding. This is abuse of power. This is someone using a badge as a weapon, to threaten, to humiliate, to impose, simply because the victim didn't behave as he expected. Brad Mercer sat frozen at the defendant's table, his collar soaked with sweat. His large hands, accustomed to giving orders, now clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He knew. Everyone in this room had seen his true nature, and no badge, no rank could hide that truth anymore. Judge Morales nodded. "Plaintiff, please call your first witness." Naomi Carter slowly stood. Her military uniform was not just fabric. It was her shield, forged through sacrifice, honesty, and the belief that true strength lies in protection, not abuse. She walked to the witness stand, her gaze straight, her voice clear. "I, Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter, solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." Naomi Carter stepped up to the witness stand, her military uniform as sharp as her posture. Straight back, forthright, leaving no room for doubt. The courtroom fell into a deep silence, only the sound of pens scratching on paper, and the faint, steady beating of hearts from those observing. She recounted every detail of that night, without exaggeration or embellishment. Only the truth, bare and cold. Each word she spoke was like a small incision, sharp but silent, cutting through the web of lies that Brad Mercer had woven from the start. When Naomi left the stand, her eyes briefly glanced over at Brad, neither with contempt nor sympathy. Just a look from someone who had won the battle of conscience, and knew that the man before her would, in the end, have to face his own darkness. Judge Morales adjusted her glasses and nodded toward the defendant's table. "Sergeant Mercer, please stand." Brad Mercer slowly stood, each movement as if the weight of his uniform had doubled. "You have the right to self-defense. Please answer the lawyer's questions." Defense attorney Charles Brenner approached, his voice trying to sound calm, but everyone could hear the unease underlying the professional facade. "Sergeant Mercer," Brenner asked, "why did you ask Lieutenant Colonel Carter to exit the vehicle that night?" Brad licked his lips, looking around the courtroom where calm yet sharp eyes were encircling him like an invisible net. He hesitated, his tongue shifting in his mouth, then muttered, "She seemed suspicious." A soft hiss came from the gallery, quickly suppressed, but enough to tighten the atmosphere. Suspicious? Just because Naomi asked why she was stopped? Just because she wasn't intimidated? Just because she dared to maintain her composure and self-respect? Delaney Price gave a slight smile, her eyes cold as steel as she stood up and approached to cross-examine. "Sergeant Mercer, may I ask, did Miss Carter do anything to threaten you?" Brad stammered, "No." "Was she showing signs of intoxication? Swerving? Swearing?" "No," Brad mumbled, his voice so faint it was almost inaudible. Delaney tilted her head, her voice not harsh but each word like a hammer coming down. "Then why did you consider her suspicious?" Brad clenched his fist, his knuckles turning white. He avoided the eyes of the jury, the judge, and Naomi's gaze, but couldn't avoid his own conscience. And then the decisive question rang out. Delaney's voice lowered but heavy. "If you had known from the start that she was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, would you have acted differently?" The entire courtroom froze. A long moment, as if the air itself stopped circulating, waiting for the answer. Brad swallowed hard, his throat dry. The dark cloak of Judge Morales loomed over him like an unspoken judgment. Finally, he gave a slight nod, his voice barely audible. "Maybe." Just 2 words. But they fell in the room like a stone, sinking into a calm lake, sending ripples that could never be erased. And with that it was clear. Brad Mercer didn't act out of safety, as he had claimed. Not because of reasonable suspicion. He acted for one reason only, his wounded ego before a black woman who refused to submit. He didn't respect the person. He only recognized submission to power. And only when that power was slapped in his face with gleaming medals and clear ranks. The courtroom was silent, eerie. Some jury members hurriedly scribbled notes. Others simply nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if a decision had already been made in their hearts. Brad Mercer bowed his head, as if now realizing it wasn't Naomi Carter, nor her medals, but his own arrogance that had led him to the brink of this downfall. Outside, dark clouds gathered, blocking the sun. Inside the courtroom, another storm had begun to sweep through, and this time it was aimed directly at the man who thought that the silver badge on his chest could conceal all his mistakes. The heavy silence enveloped the courtroom as Brad Mercer was forced to face the bitter truth of his own actions. And then, everything was placed into the hands of the jury, ordinary people, but now holding the power to judge something Brad never thought he would have to confront, the consequences. 3 days of deliberation. 3 days Naomi Carter returned to her daily life in Fort Wayne, training new soldiers, handling reports, reviewing transportation plans. Not once did she mention the trial. Not once did she complain or feel anxious. Only cold patience, the calm that had once saved her in battlefields far more brutal than a courtroom full of scrutinizing eyes. On the 3rd morning, the court sent notice. The verdict had been reached. Naomi arrived at the courthouse, still in her old military uniform, with slight creases at the collar, marks that no one else would notice, the marks of sleepless nights, of unspoken considerations. Brad Mercer was also present. His gray-green uniform was still perfectly pressed, but his face was pale, the line of his jaw stiff. He no longer sat arrogantly, no longer had that provocative look. Only a hunched figure, weighed down under the cold lights of the courtroom. Judge Cynthia Morales stepped onto the bench. When she spoke, her voice was decisive and cold, and everyone understood. The moment of judgment had arrived. In the case of Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter versus Sergeant Brad Mercer, she read slowly, each word clear, the jury has fully considered the evidence, testimonies, and arguments. No one moved. It was as if everyone held their breath, waiting for the gavel of justice to fall. We declare, The jury unanimously stands with the plaintiff. Naomi did not move, not a single blink. Only the faint glimmer in her eyes, the light of unwavering resolve, rewarded. Brad Mercer bowed his head, his hand trembling slightly. Judge Morales continued, her voice calm as if delivering an inescapable sentence. The defendant, Sergeant Mercer, has committed unlawful detention, threats, and abuse of power, violating the civil rights under the United States Constitution. The court orders Sergeant Mercer to pay civil damages to Lieutenant Colonel Carter in the amount of $35,000. A small, invisible wave passed through the courtroom, but no one clapped, no one cheered. Only a profound silence, the silence of justice finally being served. Then, Judge Morales, without changing her expression, continued. Additionally, the record of Sergeant Mercer's violation will be permanently recorded in his service record and will be forwarded to the U.S. Department of Justice and the Toledo Police Department for consideration of policy reform. No criminal charges are being filed at this time, but the record will remain open for review of any future violations. Naomi Carter silently lowered her head, not to bow to the judge or the jury, but to bow to herself, the resilient version of herself who had overcome everything to defend her dignity and that of so many others. On the other side, Brad Mercer said nothing. He simply sank into his chair, as if the hard wooden seat beneath him had finally collapsed under the weight of his arrogance that he had nurtured for so many years. Outside the courthouse, the sky was overcast. The cold wind blew across the small square in front of the courthouse, sweeping up pieces of yellowed leaves. Naomi left the courtroom, walking slowly down the stone steps, no one pushing, no reporters blocking her way. She didn't need praise. She didn't need the flash of cameras. Her victory was silence. It was justice. It was a truth that could not be twisted. Naomi Carter quietly descended the courthouse steps, leaving behind a just verdict and a man who had lost everything due to his blind arrogance. But for Brad Mercer, the nightmare was just beginning. Just a week after the trial, a cold internal memo was posted on the Toledo Police Department's bulletin board. Sergeant Brad Mercer is temporarily suspended from duty pending an internal investigation, effective immediately. No lengthy explanations, no defense. Simply, neatly, as if the system that had once shielded him now wanted to quickly rid itself of the shameful burden. In the empty hallways of the police station, the rumors spread like wildfire. Some said Mercer would be demoted. Others whispered he'd be transferred to a far-off, obscure unit with no further chances for advancement. But many, those who understood how the system worked, just chuckled bitterly. His career is over. Brad Mercer silently walked through the familiar hallways, his once broad shoulders now weighed down. Each step grew heavier, each glance from his colleagues colder. No one looked at him with the same respect they once had. No more hasty nods of greeting. No more laughter in the break room when he boasted about his victories over civilians. Now, Brad Mercer was nothing but a failure, not because of a lost lawsuit, but because the empty, rotting core of the badge he had once worn so proudly had been exposed. He sat alone in the empty parking lot, his old patrol car parked beside him like a silent witness to his irreversible decline. Brad recalled the early years in the force, the days when he believed the badge symbolized honor, service, but gradually that belief faded, replaced by a habit of wielding power, a satisfaction in giving orders and controlling. He had forgotten that. Power without responsibility is just an empty shadow. And now, when the light was shined upon that shadow, all that remained was shame. Outside, Toledo's sky was overcast, with a light drizzle hitting the windshield. Brad stared at the water droplets streaming down. each one like a heavy strike against the crumbling shell of his arrogance. He remembered the moment Naomi Carter's gaze met his in the courtroom. That look needed no words, but each ray from it seemed to carve a truth into Brad's heart, a truth he could not escape. It was his own arrogance, his own contempt for others, that was his greatest enemy. No one else. Just himself. In the days that followed, Mercer was no longer assigned any duties. He was asked to turn in his weapon, police badge, and ID, each item one by one, like a part of his identity being slowly, inevitably stripped away. No one at the station offered him comfort. No one invited him for coffee. No one even asked how he was doing. And Brad Mercer, who once thought himself invincible, finally understood the real cost of abusing power. It wasn't just a compensation check. It wasn't just a note in his file. It was a permanent loss, the loss of respect, the loss of honor, and the loss of himself. Elsewhere in the city, Naomi Carter closed her file, put it in the drawer, and locked it with a small key. For her, the battle was over, not to celebrate, not to gloat over her victory, but to remind herself, and those who came after her, silence should never be the only choice. The metal door of the Fort Wayne training room closed quietly behind Naomi Carter, separating her from the chaotic world outside, a world she had just stepped away from after a battle fought without weapons but filled with hardships. She stood before a class of recruits, the white light from the ceiling shining down on her neatly pressed uniform, causing the medals on her chest to glisten. 2 months had passed since the verdict was delivered. 2 months enough for the world outside to forget the name Brad Mercer, but for Naomi that lesson could never be forgotten. She scanned the young faces before her, still fresh in their new uniforms, eager faces, eyes untouched by the harsh realities of service life. Naomi took a deep breath, then spoke, her voice low and clear. How many of you here think that, just by wearing this uniform, you'll automatically be respected? A few hands hesitated to rise. Others glanced around, waiting to see the reactions of their peers. Naomi smiled, a gentle smile that carried an undeniable strength. "I understand," she said. "I thought the same when I first joined the military." She walked slowly down the rows, her boots clicking sharply against the polished floor. "But the truth is," she paused, turning to face the entire class, "power is not armor, it's a burden. If you can't bear it with honor, you don't deserve to wear it." The room fell silent. The recruits sat up straighter, their gazes growing more serious, as if their intuition told them that these words mattered more than any tactical lesson or skill they had learned. Naomi continued, her voice steady, measured, but each sentence was like a drill bit sinking straight into their consciousness. "There will be times," she said, "when you'll feel that this badge, this uniform, allows you to control others, to give orders. But remember, it is not a crown, it is responsibility." She stopped, her eyes flashing with a cold sharpness like steel. "Power does not define you. How you wield it defines who you are." A recruit in the second row, a young man with brown hair, fidgeted as if he wanted to ask a question. Naomi nodded, giving him permission. "Ma'am," he stammered, "if someone disrespects me first, do I have the right to respond?" Naomi looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You have the right to respond," she said. "But remember, not every insult is worth sacrificing your dignity for, and not every battle needs to be fought with fists." She lifted her head, as though looking beyond the walls, back to that dark night in Toledo, where she chose to pick up her phone, not draw a weapon. "True strength," Naomi said, "is holding to your principles even in the face of injustice." She paused for a moment, letting those words settle in the air. Then, with a quieter voice, she shared, "I was once stopped by a police officer, forced out of my car, treated like a criminal just because I wouldn't bow my head, but I didn't shout, I didn't fight back, I didn't let them turn me into the worst version of myself." Her eyes scanned the class. "I recorded it, I reported it, I went to court, and I let the truth speak for me." No one in the room leaned back in their chair. Everyone sat upright, silent, as if participating in a quiet oath. Naomi smiled softly, but her eyes shone brightly. "When you wear this uniform, when you carry this badge, you represent more than just yourself. You represent all those who have believed in the ideals of fairness, honor, and courage. Never forget, power does not define dignity. Dignity defines power." A gentle breeze from the window swept into the room, stirring the flags hanging high. And in that moment, Naomi Carter knew, though her battle had quietly ended, the flame she had ignited would continue to burn in the hearts of these young people, the ones who would go on, carrying the responsibility not just with strength, but with honor. In the Fort Wayne training room, where young faces remained silent in the heavy atmosphere filled with thoughts, Naomi Carter concluded her lesson not with chants, not with grandiose slogans. She simply stopped. A quiet, steady stop, just as she had faced Brad Mercer in the courtroom, just as she had faced countless battles before, with unwavering strength that needed no flair, no applause, no cheers. But that silence, profound and reverent, resonated louder than any clap of hands. Naomi slowly stepped down from the podium, her boots gently tapping the wooden floor, leaving behind firm, steady sounds, each step like the beat of a drum, a silent oath being sworn. In her mind, the last words echoed, not just for the class, but as a message for all who carry the dream of justice in their hearts. When facing injustice, speak up. She recalled that night in Toledo, the flashlight pressed to her face, the harsh voice, the hand hovering near the gun. She remembered the chill running down her spine, not from the weather, but from the raw truth that there are people ready to use power to crush dignity, and she had chosen not to remain silent. Do not be afraid. Naomi recalled those moments when her hand trembled over the record button, remembering the sleepless nights filled with the thoughts. Would her actions make a difference, or was she just a small drop in an ocean of injustice? But she understood. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is walking forward despite the fear. Because silence nourishes the wicked, but courage can save the world. Naomi walked past the rows of seats where the young eyes followed her, not just with respect, but with something even more valuable, awakening. She knew she wouldn't always be there to guide them, but if today she could plant a seed, an idea that honor must be protected, that power must come with responsibility, then tomorrow the world would have one less Brad Mercer. And perhaps there would be hundreds, thousands of other Naomi Carters standing up and speaking out. As she walked out of the training room, Naomi lifted her head to look at the silvery gray sky of Fort Wayne. The wind blew strong, sweeping the clouds far away, leaving a clear sky on the horizon. One chapter closed. A new chapter began. She tightened her military collar and continued walking, needing no witnesses, no applause. Because she knew, true courage doesn't need to be loud. It lives in every action, every choice, every word spoken at the right moment, in the right place, for the right cause. In a world where power is too easily abused, Naomi Carter proved that silence is not the only option, and quiet courage can change an entire system. What about you? If faced with injustice, will you choose silence or stand up to demand justice? If this story inspires you, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel so we can spread more journeys like this, full of strength and meaning.